India-Republic of Korea relations have made rapid strides in recent years. While it may have taken New Delhi and Seoul many decades to reinvigorate their relationship, the two are today in the midst of a multi-dimensional and transformative tie, especially under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Moon Jae-in. Modi's Act East policy and Moon Jae-in's New Southern policy, which gives primacy to the acceleration of economic and strategic relations, have led to a convergence of interest and energies between the two countries. There has been emphasis on developments with regard to political, cultural, and people to people relations that have deepened over the last few years. Indeed, with no unpleasant historical memories between them, nor geopolitical rivalries, there is limitless potential in this critical relationship. To discuss on the topic, which is entitled as India-South Korea's cultural linkages and strategic ties in the emerging geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, we have Dr. Sonu Trivedi ma'am, who is currently the director of the Indian Cultural Center, Embassy of India, Seoul. Before joining diplomatic position, she was a fellow at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi, and was an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, Zakir Hussain College, University of Delhi. She was also a visiting fellow at Institute of Asia Pacific Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Beijing, and was also a member of Myanmar Core Group at Indian Council of World Affairs. Ma'am, we are privileged, overwhelmed, and honored to have you on our platform of All India Debating Society. You remain our constant source of motivation and inspiration, and we look forward to hearing your lecture. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Roshan. First of all, let me congratulate the entire team of Indian Debating Society for taking this initiative during this times of COVID pandemic crisis, and in fact thinking out of the box. And I would also like to thank your entire team for inviting me to participate in this online discussion. It's really a privilege for me to be a part of this entire exercise and also to connect with some of my former students here. So before I begin with my presentation today, I would just like to say that talking about India-South Korea relations, as a researcher, yes, I have been following it since a long time. But now, as I'm holding this diplomatic position in South Korea, based at Seoul, in fact, I'm getting an opportunity to learn about this entire dynamic of relationship between the two countries from the first hand. So some of these first-hand information also I would be sharing with you today. But just to begin with, since the title of today's lecture is India-South Korea cultural and strategic ties in the emerging geopolitics of Indo-Pacific, I would like to begin with giving you an overview of the Indo-Pacific region. Because unless you have a perspective about the Indo-Pacific region, it will be very difficult to understand how the dynamics of the entire relationship between India and South Korea is shaping the future trajectory of the region. So that is why just let me begin with giving you an overview of the Indo-Pacific region, and thereby after that I move over to India-South Korea relations. And here, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific region, let me give you a theoretical framework. At the descriptive level, Indo-Pacific is just a neutral name for a new and expansive map centered on maritime Asia. This conveys that Pacific and Indian Oceans are connecting through trade, infrastructure, and diplomacy, and countries of the region rely on the sea lanes of Indian Ocean to ship oil from the Middle East and Africa and other cargoes in both directions along the world's vital commercial artery. In fact, a review of literature, when you look at various literature, various scholars who have written on Indo-Pacific, you'll see that a large amount of literature has proliferated in recent times, which focuses on the need for defining the region, particularly in the context of spatial, geocultural, geopolitical, and strategic context. So here in my presentation, I have tried to define the region, that is the Indo-Pacific region, in these four contexts. First, let me briefly define the region in the spatial concept. And as a spatial concept, we define Indo-Pacific as a biogeographic region. And it was considered as a connected region in the biogeography of marine species and ocean currents. In fact, there are several scholars who have defined Indo-Pacific as a biogeographic region. And here I would like to give the reference of the scholar Rory Metcalf. In fact, Rory Metcalf defines it as, he says, just to quote him, "It has long been a useful concept for understanding the interaction between zones of the world, such as impacts on climate and ocean currents. The spectacular diversity of fish species where ocean meet, or the slow but unstoppable movement of early humanity across the globe." In fact, basically here, when you talk about the spatial concept of Indo-Pacific, we talk about how in the biogeographic region of this Indian Ocean, how the movements of fish has defined the geography of the region. And again, another reference I would like to give here is of a scholar, Wilhelm G. Solheim. He says that the core of this early super region was home to fishing and trading communities described as Nusanto. And these Nusanto were a kind of sea gypsies community, and they were prevalent in Philippines. They were called as Bajau in Philippines. Also in Malaysia, they were called as Bajau, Orang Lot in Indonesia, Tangka in southern China, and Dan in Vietnam. And these gypsies, sea gypsies, by their small acts of traveling and trading, the Nusanto created a vast network of sail and paddle power, which could transport sea slugs from northern Australia to dining tables of southern China, and banana trees from forests of New Guinea to the gardens of Madagascar. And on each journey, goods, knowledge, and culture passed back and forth. In fact, I'm giving this reference just to show how the culture from one country to the other has been carried forward by these sea gypsies, these communities who have traveled from one region to another. And also, when you talk about Indo-Pacific as a biogeographic region, we also talk about how fish species have shaped the geography of this region. And again, there is another scholar, Professor Tan Sen Sen. He's based in China. He says, while describing the region, he says, "Just ask the fish." Basically, as I have told you, that the way fish moves in the ocean, that also has defined the geography of Indo-Pacific. And according to Professor Tan Sen Sen, the term reflects the historical realities of the connected maritime spaces of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Oceanic connections are apparent in the studies of marine biology and climatic phenomena. Marine biologists have pointed out that the diversity of fish in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly at the juncture of the two oceans, is more pronounced than anywhere else on the earth. And in fact, when you talk about Indo-Pacific region, the first reference of any institution being called as Indo-Pacific goes back to 1948, when the Food and Agricultural Organization was set up, and Food and Agricultural Organization had set up Indo-Pacific Fisheries Council in Philippines. So this is the first reference to any particular institution which was named after the concept of Indo-Pacific. This was in 1948. And now coming to from biogeography concept, I come over to geocultural concept. So here, basically, I would refer to some of the noted scholars and geographers, how they have defined the region. Here, I would like to give the reference of noted geographer George B. Creasy. George B. Creasy uses it in a geocultural context in his book, Asia's Land and People. This was in 1963. He has suggested that the region be called as Indo-Pacific since it lies between two oceans and cultures. Another very important prominent scholar from India, historian Kalidas Nag, has used the term to denote the benign influence of the India in the region. According to Kalidas Nag, the expansion of the Indian culture in Pacific world is a grand chapter in human history. Though India played a very important role in drama of ethnic and cultural diffusion, he believes that Indian scholars have sufficiently not given importance to this line of research. And therefore, in fact, Indian scholars have placed more importance on doing further research on this concept of Indo-Pacific. There's another scholar, A.H. Keen. He refers to the concept of Indo-Pacific as migration of culture from Asia to America, staged on the vast expanse of water extending from Indian Ocean to the Pacific. And he categorizes this region as the Indo-Pacific domain. Now coming over to the geopolitical construct. In fact, again, two important scholars I would like to refer here. One is Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan, he's a famous naval historian. Way back in 1890, he predicted about the primacy of sea power in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Whoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia. He says, just to quote him, whoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia. In the 21st century, the destiny of the world would be decided on its water. Then after Alfred Thayer Mahan, I'm referring to another German geographer, a very famous one, Karl Hochhofer. He understood the geopolitical potential of the Indo-Pacific in 1920s and 30s. And he calls the countries of the region as Asiatic monsoon countries. And why he calls it as Asiatic monsoon countries, I further explain here. Just again to quote Karl Hochhofer, with a uniform climate rhythm of the monsoon, more than half the world's population and age-old Indian and East Asian culture, the region contains two greatest concentrations of mankind ever witnessed in the history of the world. Those countries are beginning to stir and rise. He calls Indo-Pacific as Asiatic monsoon countries since they have a uniform climate rhythm of the monsoon, extending from the mouth of the Indus to that of the Amur River and taking in the littoral of Southeast Asia, as well as the divides of the large central highlands of Asia. Robert Kaplan is another scholar who has defined the concept in geopolitical, in the context of geopolitical construct. And he regards Indian Ocean comprising of the India, Chinese, Arabs, and Persian trading arrangements, creating a grand network of cross-ocean communal ties brought even closer over the centuries by the monsoon wind. This ocean is once again at the heart of the world, just as it was in the antique and medieval times. And finally, again, I'm referring to Rory Metcalf. He says that quintessential Indo-Pacific power in this region will be China, and indispensable will be the United States. And the big powers interaction with some of the countries literally in the middle, notably Indonesia, Australia, Singapore, but also, for instance, Burma, will influence whether strategic differences can be reasonably controlled. I'm just giving you this background just to understand this concept. What is Indo-Pacific and how does, when we talk about India and South Africa, India and South Korea ties, how it shapes the trajectory of the future trajectory of the region. So in this background, I'm just referring to these concepts as has been outlined by important thinkers. So after giving these maybe theoretical background, let me just move on to how different world leaders have defined this terminology, which is Indo-Pacific. And here, when you go back to 2007, it was for the first time that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talked about the concept of Indo-Pacific. And to quote him, we are now at a point at which confluence of the two seas is coming into being. The Pacific and the Indian Oceans are now bringing about a dynamic coupling as seas of freedom and of prosperity. A broader Asia that broke away geographical boundaries is now beginning to take on a distinct form. This was the speech by the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe when he came to India, and the speech was given by him in the Parliament of India on August 22nd, 2007. Then the second reference, one important reference to Indo-Pacific has been given by Hillary Clinton when she was the US Secretary of State. This was in October 28, 2010. In one of the conferences, she talks about the concept, our defense posture, to quote her, our defense posture will become more politically sustainable, operationally resilient, and geographically dispersed. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we are shifting our presence to reflect these principles. and we are expanding our work with the Indian Navy in the Pacific because we understand how important the Indo-Pacific basin is to global trade and commerce. This was by Hillary Clinton when she was the US Secretary of State. The next important leader which I would like to refer here, who has talked about Indo-Pacific, this was President Obama. He gave this speech in Australian Parliament on November 17, 2011. And to quote him, as the world's fastest growing region and home to more than half the global economy, the Asia Pacific is critical to achieving my highest priority, and that's creating jobs and opportunity for the American people. As president, I have therefore made a deliberate and strategic decision. As a Pacific nation, the United States will play a larger and long-term role in shaping this region and its future by upholding core principles and in close partnership with our allies and friends. Then comes our own Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh in 2012. He used it for the first time. To quote him again, I feel our future is interlinked and a stable, secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific region is crucial for our own progress and prosperity. This was the speech given by Dr. Manmohan Singh at the plenary session of India-ASEAN Commemorative Summit in December 20th, 2012. After that, in 2013, we see Australian Defence White Paper giving reference to the concept of Indo-Pacific, and that came for the first time in 2013. And again, one line I'm quoting from Australian Defence White Paper. A new Indo-Pacific strategic arc is connecting the Indian and the Pacific Ocean throughout Southeast Asia. This was the line which became a guiding principle for Australian concept of Indo-Pacific. And after that, we have the US President Trump talking about this concept in 2017. In November 2017, President Trump, during his visit to Japan, focused on strategic priorities towards a shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And again at Da Nang in Vietnam, he outlines the US vision of Indo-Pacific as follows. To quote him again, I have had the honor of sharing our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, a place where sovereign and independent nations with diverse cultures and many different dreams can all prosper side by side and thrive in freedom and in peace. I call it the Indo-Pacific dream. If it's going to be realized, we must ensure that all play by the rules, which they do not right now. This was the speech by US President Trump at APEC summit in Da Nang, Vietnam on November 10th, 2017. Then several documents in United States, I'm not going to read from the documents, but I'm just giving you reference in case if anyone is interested can refer to it. National Security Strategy of USA, which came up in December 2017. This concept was elaborated, and further in 2018, National Defense Strategy of the United States further elaborated this concept. And later in 2016 again, Admiral Harry Harris, who was the chief of the US Pacific Command, has used this concept. And in fact, it's very interesting. I just wanted to make the reference of what Admiral Harry Harris had said about this this entire region. He says the Pacific Command area of responsibility stretches from Hollywood to Bollywood. In fact, this concept from Hollywood to Bollywood denotes the entire area, entire jurisdiction which US thinks comes under the domain of Indo-Pacific. Then further, Secretary of Defense, US Secretary of Defense James Mattis has further defined it, and to quote him, in recognition of the increasing connectivity, the Indian and the Pacific Oceans today, we rename the US Pacific Command to US Indo-Pacific Command. It is a primary combatant command. It's standing watch and intimately engaged with over half of the Earth's surface and its diverse population from Hollywood to Bollywood, from polar bears to penguins. So these keywords are very important when you define the concept of Indo-Pacific, or when you try to understand the region. In fact, our Prime Minister Modi has defined Indo-Pacific region in Shangri-La Dialogue. When he talked about Indo-Pacific region, he says that again to quote Prime Minister Modi, he says that India's own engagement in the Indo-Pacific region extends from the shores of Africa to that of America. But in contrast, when you see the US concept of Indo-Pacific, they say it extends from Hollywood to Bollywood, from polar bears to penguins. This means that they cover the entire world. Polar bear to penguins. Polar bear means the Arctic Circle, and penguins denotes the Australia. So it covers from north to south and from east to west, from Hollywood to Bollywood. So in fact, they consider the entire world coming under Indo-Pacific, and they have also renamed the Pacific Command. The Pacific Command of US was renamed in 2018 as Indo-Pacific Command. So that is why I just wanted to give this perspective of how different world leaders are viewing this region, and particularly the concept of Indo-Pacific. But here we have just a contrast view, which is given by the Chinese foreign minister, because this concept has not been accepted by by countries like China, and China thinks that all the other countries, say India, South Korea, United States, Australia, they are using this concept of Indo-Pacific just to contain China. And therefore, I would just like to quote this statement by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He gave this in March 2018 at annual media conference in Beijing. To quote him, he says, describing the region as the Indo-Pacific instead of Asia-Pacific is an attention-grabbing idea that will dissipate like ocean foam. So this is a very strong statement where he says that the countries like India, it means that countries like India, Australia, United States are trying to use this concept from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific just to gain attention from other countries of the region. And this is just like a foam, and this will dissipate just like ocean foam. So this was just a contrast view that I just wanted to give you. And again, before coming to India-South Korea relations, when you talk about this entire geopolitical reality of Indo-Pacific, three important things that I would like to highlight here is the rise of India. Second is the China's assertiveness, the aggressive rise of China. And the third is United States rebalancing strategy. So when you try to understand the approach of any country in this entire Indo-Pacific region, you have to take into consideration these three very important concepts and these three very important phenomena, which is the rise of India, China's assertiveness, and the United States rebalancing strategy in the region. So this was the background under which I just wanted to fix the entire India-South Korea relationship. And now I come to the main part of my presentation, which is the cultural and strategic ties between the two countries of India and South Korea. And now, since I have given you a very theoretical perspective about the Indo-Pacific region, let me begin the relationship between India and South Korea with a story. And this story goes back to AD 48. And the story is about a princess from Ayodhya called Suriratna. She traveled through river and crossing the oceans. She reached the Korean peninsula, and this has been explained, and the reference you can find in one of the important legendary book of South Korea, which is called as Sayuk Yusa. According to Sayuk Yusa, or the heritage history of the three kingdoms, written in 13th century, it is believed that a princess from Ayodhya, her name in India was Suriratna, she came to Korea and married Kim Suro and became Queen Ho in the year 1948. So this is a long story, this legendary story based on Korean mythology. But yes, till today, people in Korea believe in this mythological story, and they still think that they have a common Indian blood in their in their body. And in fact, after this queen arrived from Ayodhya to Korea and married King Suro, in fact, they laid a foundation of a major dynasty which was called as Karak dynasty. And Kim is a common surname in Korea, and King Kim Suro is considered to be father of the Kim clan, which is based in Gimhae. Gimhae is a very important province in Korea, and it is believed that this queen from Ayodhya had traveled on a ship and reached Gimhae, and thereafter she married Kim Suro, and both of them, they laid the foundation of Karak dynasty. And even today, all the almost you can say a large number of population in Korea, they have surname of Kim, and all these Kims, they owe their historical origin to India. And this legendary story is very famous so far as and very important so far as the India-Korea cultural connect is concerned. And let me also very briefly tell you this story. The Karak clan society in Gimhae is the torchbearer of this venerable heritage. The society has established contacts with Ayodhya and has erected a memorial for Queen Ho on the banks of Saryu River in India. When you go to Ayodhya, in fact, a sister city partnership has been signed between Gimhae province in South Korea and Ayodhya city in India. And on the banks of Saryu River, in fact, they have they are trying to build up a memorial for Queen Ho in her memory. The foundation stone has been laid down, but still it will take some time to finish the entire construction of this memorial. Gimhae and Ayodhya have sister city relationship, and the society members regularly visit Ayodhya to pay their homage to the land of their queen. Kim is the most common family name of the Korean peninsula for those who claim their ancestry from King Kim Suro. One branch of Kims, the Gimhae Kims, believe that they are the descendants of Queen Ho and have an ancient genealogical link with India. The Gimhae Kims are proud of this lineage and invariably mention this fact whenever they meet Indian visitors. In fact, former president of South Korea, Kim Dae-jung, and former Prime Minister Kim Jong-pil, and several other leaders, their surname is Kim, and they have a strong emotional connection with India. And in Gimhae, there is a royal tomb of King Suro and a royal tomb of Queen Suriratna. On the same model, they are planning to build up a memorial in Ayodhya. In fact, I had some photos, maybe later this can be shared. And let me just to carry forward this story. In fact, MOU was signed between India and South Korea in 2019. At that time, Prime Minister Modi had visited India in February 2019, and they had signed an MOU for releasing a postage stamp in the memory of Queen Ho. And this was released in July 2019. So 2 stamps have been released in India in the memory of Queen Ho. It is of the value of rupees 5 and rupees 20, rupees 5 and 25, and it has the image of Queen Ho. And similarly, the Korea Post had also released similar stamp, and it is of the value of 380 won in Korea. So this was about the story of princess from Ayodhya coming to Korea, marrying the Korean king, and then laying the foundation of Karak dynasty, and how the people of India and Korea have common lineage. The second important cultural connection which I would like to highlight here is about the advent of Buddhism in Korea. In fact, Koreans in ancient time knew about India mainly through Buddhist monks and the texts and the legends. Buddhism was introduced to Korea in the second half of 4th century during the reign of Kim Sosurim. This was in the year 371 to 384 AD. It was officially recognized in Korea. Buddhism was officially recognized in Korea during this time. It got wide acceptance and being embraced by all the three kingdoms and further by unified Silla and Koryo dynasty. However, most of the time, the early interactions between the Korean and the Indian monks was through China, as Korea was closer to China in its cultural practices, and Buddhist teachings and ideas coming via China were easier to adopt. Nonetheless, Korean monks did understand the importance of India as the birthplace of Buddha. Indian culture, along with Buddhism, was assimilated in Korean indigenous culture over centuries during the course of history. This process was facilitated by the travels and pilgrimages of numerous monks and scholars, mostly from Korea and India, and some from India to Korea after their a brief stay in China. Local monks believe that Girimisa and Golgulusa temple, these are two important temples in South Korea. They were established by Indian monks, and these monks, when they had traveled to India, they had adopted Korean name, and the Korean name was Gwangju, and this temple was established in 643 AD. Similarly, there are references of other Korean monks traveling to India and Indian monks traveling to India. A detailed description maybe during question and answer. I can just elaborate this further. The third important cultural and historical connection I would like to refer here is the resonance in the national movement of the two countries. And this is during the national movement of India as well as during the national movement in Korea, and particularly the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru have greatly inspired the Koreans in their national liberation movement. And the most important here I would like to refer is the contribution of Rabindranath Tagore. Though Rabindranath Tagore never visited Korea, but in fact, when he was in Japan, one of the Korean nationalists, he met Tagore and he talked about the condition, the colonial occupation of Korea by Japan, and he asked for some inspiration, and there Rabindranath Tagore wrote a 4-line poem which became very inspirational for Koreans. And in fact, even now in Korean textbooks in the school level, these 4 lines of Tagore are taught to every Korean. So there is no Korean in South Korea who has not come across or who has not read Tagore. And these 4 lines of Tagore poem has been prescribed in the Korean textbooks. I would just like to read this 4-line poem, which has become iconic and talks about the contribution of Tagore, where Tagore has talked about the glorious past and the promising bright future for Korea. And to quote Tagore, the title of this poem is "The Lamp of the East." He says, "In the golden age of Asia, Korea was one of its lamp bearers, and the lamp is waiting to be lit once again for the illumination of the East." These 4 lines have been really inspiring, and it played a very important role in the national liberation movement in Korea. People were very much inspired by these 4 lines. And therefore, every Korean, even child, knows about Rabindranath Tagore. The second important leader, which is very popular, and his writings also played a very important role in the national liberation movement in Korea, is Mahatma Gandhi. And in fact, his message was also published in one of the leading newspapers in Korea. This was in 1927. And I'm just trying to read this message. This was again 1-line message. To quote Gandhi, "The message I can send is to hope that Korea will come to her own through ways absolutely truthful and non-violent." And this 1 line of Mahatma Gandhi became a great inspiration for the Koreans during the national liberation movement when they were fighting the Japanese colonialism. And in fact, the Korean president Kim Dae-jung was also inspired by Gandhi. And let me briefly tell you about his inspiration. Former President Kim Dae-jung has written that Gandhi resembled Jesus Christ because the lives of both was characterized by unselfish love of neighbors, total sacrifice, a lifestyle as austere as that of the masses, magnanimity towards his enemies, and even his assassination at the end by one of his own race and the religion he loved. And then I would like to give a reference to another scholar who is considered as Gandhi of Korea, Cho Man-sik. Cho Man-sik is known as Gandhi of Korea. He came into contact with the Gandhian ideas of non-violence and self-sufficiency. Cho created a national league along with the leaders of consumer cooperatives, which gave birth to the Korean production movement. The movement aimed to encourage local production in Korea as the market was flooded with Japanese goods. So this is the inspiration of Swadeshi movement, which was carried forward by Gandhi, and this was adopted by Cho Man-sik in Korea. The ideas and ideals of Gandhi gained so much momentum in Korea that many organizations emphasizing self-production mushroomed. Lee Chong-sik, in his book Politics of Korean Nationalism, observes that many Japanese felt forced to close their businesses and farms because of the anti-Japanese sentiments. And this was again due to the Swadeshi movement and the concept which was adopted by the Koreans in their national liberation movement against Japan. And let me quote the current president Moon Jae-in, the statement that he gave last year in the United Nations General Assembly when the meeting was held to commemorate the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. To quote President Moon Jae-in, India and Korea, both of which underwent the tribulations of colonialism, were companions of liberation that gave inspiration and courage to each other. Gandhi's teachings serve as compass for peace on Korean peninsula. Jawaharlal Nehru is another, quickly I will cover Jawaharlal Nehru. He was another leader with whom the Koreans have been quite influenced. Jawaharlal Nehru, a keen student of world history, observed closely the Korean struggle against Japanese imperialism. In his famous letter from father to his daughter, he wrote about the historic March 1st movement of Korea. In fact, March 1st movement is very important in the democratic history of Korea. And he is giving reference to this March 1st democratic movement in his book, The Letters from a Father to His Daughter, to quote Nehru. For many years, the struggle for independence continued and there were many outbreaks, the most important being the one of 1919. The people of Korea, and particularly the youth, struggled gallantly against tremendous odds. The suppression of the Koreans by the Japanese is a very sad and dark chapter in history. And later on, during the Korean War, in fact, India played a very important role. And there, Jawaharlal Nehru being the Prime Minister of India, he played a very important role in bilateral negotiations in solving the Korean crisis when the Korean War erupted during the time of 1950 and up till 1953. And in one of his speeches, he says, where freedom is menaced or justice threatened and aggression takes place, we shall not and cannot be neutral. This speech he gave in reference to the Korean War, which took place in 1950. And talking about the historical connection, and one very important reference which I would like to give here is about Rahul Sanskritayan. Mahapandit Rahul Sanskritayan, a well-known figure in field of Buddhist studies and Hindi literature, toured Japan, Korea, and China in 1934. He has left a detailed travelogue which was published in Hindi in 1936 and was instrumental in making Northeast Asian culture and customs known to inquisitive Indian readers. In Korea, Sanskritayan visited several Buddhist temples and was received with great respect as he came from birthplace of Buddha. He went on a day tour to Diamond Mountain and visited several monasteries. He has vividly described Korean food, houses, dresses, and habits, as well as about rural and city life. So in the writings of Rahul Sanskritayan, you can also see reference to Korean culture, its food, houses, dress habits, etc. The fourth cultural influence that I would like, historical, cultural and historical influence that I would like to elaborate here is about the role of India during the Korean War, which was the period is 1950 to 53. At that time, India was a newly independent country, and I have given you the reference of Jawaharlal Nehru when he gave this very important speech where he says that where freedom is menaced or justice threatened and aggression takes place, we shall not and cannot be neutral. And in fact, India under his leadership also played a very important role in bilateral negotiations in ending the Korean War. But one of the most important contribution of India during the Korean War was the military, the medical team, the medical team, the team of doctors that came to India. In fact, India is among the 21 countries which participated in the war and had sent medical teams and custodian force to deal with prisoners of war. In fact, this unit, which came from India, consisted of 346 personnel and served in the Korean theater for 3.5 years. It provided assistance to 2 lakhs wounded and carried out 2,300 field surgeries. Later, as fighting was subsiding in 1953, India sent 6,000 soldiers to form the custodian force of India, which was tasked with looking after prisoners of war and resolving the issue of repatriation. India was also a part of political and bilateral negotiation, as I have pointed out, for putting the end to the war. And in fact, this year we are celebrating 50 years of Korean War, and several exhibitions and several memory projects are being organized to commemorate this the history of Korean War. And the Indian war veterans, they have been also felicitated by the Korean government. And in fact, a friendship park has been also inaugurated in India. So that is one of the major landmarks which connects the India and Korea connection. And another important connection which I would like to highlight is the common linkage that we find between the Korean language. Korean language is called as Hangul. Hangul, the Korean Hangul and Indian connection. And it is believed that there is a strong connection between the Korean language and Tamil language. And researchers, they have identified 500 words in Tamil which resembles the Korean word. And just to give some examples, there is a Korean word called aphada, which is avadhi padu in Tamil, which means in pain or suffering. Similarly, vanakam is hello in Tamil. In Korean, it is wangapa. Manai is wife, and manaru. So these are similar words like null. Null is a day in Korean as well as Tamil. So there are various words which you can see there are similarity. Around 500 words are similar in Tamil and Korean language. And this was the historical connection which I had pointed out, be it the story of Suriratna or advent of Buddhism or the resonance in the national movement and influenced by the Indian leaders, even the language connection. But now let me focus about the contemporary cultural ties. Talks about the Korean wave or the Hallyu effect. Hallyu is a term that literally translates to flow of Korea. It refers to the growing popularity of South Korean culture across the globe, and India is currently in the grip of. It is also in the grip of this wave. The K craze has caught up with millennials all over the country who can't get enough of South Korean music, shows, beauty products, language, or food. So one of the important aspect of this Hallyu effect is K-pop. The second is K-food. Korean food is, though it is different from Indian food, but Korean ramen, Korean noodles, these are very popular in India. The third aspect of this K-wave is Korean beauty, K-beauty. Korean beauty products have also caught the fancy of youngsters across the country. In fact, the 10-step Korean beauty skincare routine, which includes cleansing, moisturizing, dehydrating, and face masks, is quite popular in India. The facial mask sheets, however, are a hit with customers. The fourth aspect of this K wave is K language. Korean language across are gaining Korean language courses are gaining popularity among Indians as well. Every year, more than 1,000 students are learning Korean language. One of the main reasons why students are opting for the Korean language is mainly to enhance job opportunities in Korean companies. Another is because of their great love for K-pop. And also, since they are also following K-drama, so they want to learn the Korean language. So it has become really popular. And the last aspect of K-wave, which I would like to refer here, is K-drama. Shows like You Are My Destiny and Guardian, The Lonely and the Great God are some of the must-watch TV list of youngsters. And most of the K-dramas are very popular on Netflix also, and very popular amongst the Indian youth. So this was just some of the some aspect of the current contemporary influence of Korea that we have in India. So it is not just one way Indian influence in Korea, but yes, we also see this Hallyu effect, the Korean wave coming to India and capturing the entire imagination of young Indians. And when we talk about these connections, let me also say that on 15th of August, we celebrate our Independence Day, and what a unique connection that we have with Korea. In fact, the Korean Independence Day, the National Liberation Day of Korea, also falls on 15th of August. So 15th August 1947 is our Independence Day, and 15th of August 1945 is the National Liberation Day. With this, historical and cultural background, I move to the bilateral and strategic ties. In fact, India and South Korea relations have made great strides in recent years, and it has become multidimensional. The bilateral consular relations were established in 1962, which was upgraded to ambassadorial level in 1973. And later on, a comprehensive economic partnership was operationalized on 1st January 2010 between the two countries. And after this comprehensive economic partnership agreement in 2010, in fact, our relationship was further upgraded. And one of the most important aspects of this upgradation was that our relationship, we had the strategic partnership. Was established between the two countries, and this was in January 2010. And in course of time, South Korea's open market policies and the new Southern policy found resonance with India's economic liberalization. And also we find a closer connection between India's Look East policy or the present Act East policy with the South Korea's new Southern policy. And in fact, in 2015, the bilateral relationship was upgraded to special strategic partnership during the state visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2015. So we see how the relationship from 48, you can say 48 AD, when the princes of Ayodhya visited Korea, from there till the present times, how this relationship from cultural and civilizational linkages to the consular relationship, which was further upgraded to ambassadorial level, to the strategic partnership, and now to the special strategic partnership. So this in fact defines the entire domain of India-South Korea relationship. And in fact, the relationship has witnessed new momentum following the inauguration of President Moon Jae-in's administration. And in fact, we see a very nice chemistry, perfect chemistry between the two heads of the state, Moon Jae-in and Prime Minister Modi, and they have met several times at various world summits, and also they have had bilateral exchanges between when they have visited India, or when Prime Minister Modi has visited South Korea, or when Moon Jae-in has visited India. And in fact, in 2018, Prime Minister Modi was conferred the prestigious Seoul Peace Prize. And this was for his contribution to international cooperation and fostering global economic growth. And let me also tell you, just to revive the ancient civilizational linkages between India and Korea, the first lady of South Korea, Miss Kim Jong-suk, visited India during Deepotsav festival. This was in November. When she visited November 2018 during the Deepotsav festival, and she participated at the groundbreaking ceremony for the construction of the new memorial for Queen Suriratna, or Queen Ho, as she is popularly known in Korea, or Queen Suriratna, as she is popularly known in Ayodhya. So this was a very important landmark visit by the First Lady of South Korea to India. When she participated in this Deepotsav festival, and also she laid down the groundbreaking ceremony for the construction of the new memorial for the Queen. In fact, when we talk about this strategic relationship between the two countries, one of the most important aspects which I would like to highlight here is defense cooperation between the two countries. In fact, defense cooperation and strengthened military ties in recent years forms a major contour of a truly strategic bilateral India-ROK relationship. And last year in September, Defense Minister Sri Rajnath Singh had visited South Korea, and number of MOUs and bilateral agreements were signed. I'm not elaborating here. If somebody is interested later during Q&A, we can further highlight it. And another important aspect of India-South Korea relationship is about the economic cooperation. Needless to say, economics has been the principal driver of South Korea's changed outlook. It is viewed that South Korea's new economic partnership with India and ASEAN countries will reduce over-dependence on traditional trade allies like China and the United States. In fact, the bilateral trade between the two countries has reached up to a target, up to a level of US dollar 20 billion in 2019, and both the countries, they have set up a target of US dollar 50 billion to be reached up till 2030. And in fact, India and South Korean economies are highly complementary. And just to quote Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he gave a very important statement when he visited South Korea in February 2019. To quote him, we consider Korea as a valuable partner in India's economic transformation. And therefore, this close ties between India and South Korea, especially in economic cooperation, is very significant. In course of time, South Korea's open market policies has found resonance with India's economic liberalization. And with this, in fact, let me also very briefly give you how this entire strategic partnership between India and South Korea becomes very important in this entire geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. Since I have already given you the background of what is this Indo-Pacific region and why it has become very significant, particularly from the strategic point of view. And if you remember, in the beginning, I had talked about from the strategic point of view, the region has become very significant, particularly because of the rise and assertiveness and the aggressive rise of China, and also because of the United States rebalancing strategy in the region. And here, the role of India is like a balancer. So here, when you talk about the role of India and South Korea, both the countries, they are playing the role of a balancer, where they are trying to balance China and United States against each other, because these are the two major competitive powers in the region. And India, South Korea, along with other countries, they are trying to balance China against United States, or United States against China. At times, they try to also follow the policy of hedging. Hedging is a policy where you try to enter into economic partnership with one country and security partnership with another country. So here, countries like India and South Korea, they have entered into economic partnership with China. So they are trying to balance China by entering into economic engagements with China. At the same time, they are trying to also balance United States in the region by entering into security cooperation with United States. So here, this is how both India and South Korea, they are approaching they are approaching or they are adopting their strategies in this Indo-Pacific region to balance both the countries, China and United States, and all the strategies that they are adopting are in fact focused towards this balancing strategy. And talking about, since I have already talked about the historical and cultural connection between the two countries, strategic and bilateral ties, briefly I'll just highlight the important points, the convergences between India and South Korea. This is just to summarize whatever I have just spoken. First is the first convergences that you find between the two countries is again the historical and cultural legacy from the mythological story of princess from Ayodhya Suriratna coming to Korea and her marriage to King Suro, to the advent of Buddhism in the country and resonance in the national movement of the two countries in the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, along with the support in the Korean War in the contemporary history. The people of India and Korea have always shared a close bond for a long period. It has made great strides in recent years and has become truly multidimensional, spurred by a significant convergence of interest and mutual goodwill. The second important convergence is about the growing synergy and complementarity between South Korea's New Southern policy and India's Act East policy, both of which seek to establish a stable, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Let me tell you that this New Southern policy is the policy which has been initiated by the President Moon Jae-in, and which aims at connecting with ASEAN countries and also with India. So this New Southern policy is focused towards ASEAN and India in particular, which is closely related with our India's Act East policy. Another most interesting aspect of the growing proximity between India and South Korea is the Indo-Pacific focus and convergences on a rules-based and inclusive regional architecture. Indo-Pacific I have already highlighted. India, South Korea also converge. They have considerable synergies in economic cooperation. South Korea's export-driven economy, expertise in shipbuilding, steel, nuclear energy, heavy electrical machinery has immense potential for India's huge market. Similarly, South Korea wants to take advantage of India's prowess in IT software and to combine it with its expertise in IT hardware. So India's software and South Korea's hardware, they make a very strong connection. So, and designing, engineering, and they aim to combine all these things, designing, engineering, and manufacturing of this hardware, and combining it with the India's software industry. The two countries are exploring commercial opportunities in space, defense, and nuclear energy areas also. Defense cooperation I've already highlighted also is an important area of convergence so far as the strategic interests between two countries are concerned. Another area of convergence and synergy is the area of maritime security. Both sides, both countries, in fact, have taken steps towards operationalizing joint plans that better reflect shared interest in their maritime commons. And finally, both the countries, they also connect on one common issue, which is the assertive rise of China. So these are some of the important convergences that I just wanted to highlight between the two countries. Having given this background about the convergences between India and South Korea, particularly in the field of historical and cultural ties, in the field of economic cooperation, defense cooperation, maritime security, we now move forward to India-South Korea relations in the post-COVID world order. In fact, when you talk about post-COVID world order, many huge and you can say major change has taken place in the world order, though it is too early to sense the shape of post-COVID world order, but still there are some hints which should be taken into consideration. And here I would just like to highlight some very important points which should be taken into consideration when we talk about a post-COVID world order. The first one which I would like to highlight is the rise of new multilateralism. In fact, in the post-pandemic world, policymakers around the world are becoming acutely aware that no individual country can ensure security of its own. a multilateral approach could become the mainstay of a new management of common problems on the global scale. The second important fact that I would like to highlight here is the emergence of multipolarity in this post-COVID world order. We see a diplomatic vacuum created in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, with United States severely failing to control it and China as the principal player involved in spreading it. In this diplomatic vacuum, we see emergence of a multipolar world in which middle powers are designated to play a very important role. And taking in forward, the third important point which I would like to highlight here in this post-COVID world order is the role of middle powers. There is a potential for solidarity among the middle powers of the region to manage China's power and its assertiveness. As US-China conflict is becoming more intense and focused, role of middle powers and multilateralism is increasingly becoming the order of the day. And it is believed that countries like India, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Australia, Indonesia may emerge as significant players in reshaping and redesigning the strategic contours of the world and architecture of world politics. In fact, in this post-COVID world, we see a rise of new era of global cooperation and summit diplomacy. It has opened a new era of global cooperation against the prevailing view of decoupling and deglobalization. The current spread of pandemic has shown that what matters is global security or global village security, or in the context of India, we can call it as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in its truest sense. And in fact, another important development so far as the post-COVID world is concerned, national security has been now defined in terms of human security. One interesting aspect of this pandemic is that in the past, we have always thought about security in terms of national security. However, the current spread of the pandemic showed that the national security concept is fundamentally flawed and incomplete unless complemented by human security. International cooperation in the form of human security has emerged as a core challenge in this post-pandemic world, and non-traditional security threats have acquired prominence. So given this background of this post-COVID world, let us briefly touch upon how this has influenced India-South Korea relationship. And in fact, here I would just like to highlight how this excellent chemistry between the two heads of the state, Prime Minister Modi and President Moon, this has brought these two countries very close. And in fact, I would like to refer to this telephonic conversation between the Prime Minister Modi and President Moon, which took place on 9th of April 2020. And in fact, this is there widespread in social media. You can just see how Prime Minister Modi had tweeted saying that had a telephonic conversation with President Moon on the prevailing COVID-19 situation and how we can fight this pandemic through cooperation and leveraging the power of technology. And this was reciprocated by President Moon when he retweeted saying that both Prime Minister Modi and I believe that with unity and solidarity, we can tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Apart from the test kits we have already sent to India, we aim to share our medical data and experience. I believe the current crisis will strengthen our bilateral ties. Why I'm talking about this is because, in fact, when you talk about this COVID pandemic, in fact, South Korea has emerged as a world leader, and how it has managed the crisis, how it had flattened the curve, and how it had it has kept this the spread of pandemic under control. It has become a model for the world to follow, and therefore India has also shown its outreach to South Korea, and the best way was and the first step in this direction was made by Prime Minister Modi when he approached President Moon through a telephonic conversation. And then we also see our External Affairs Minister Shri Jaishankar having entered into video conference dialogue with the Foreign Minister of South Korea, and this took place on May 19th, 2020. And after that, we also see in-depth interaction between the Indian entrepreneurs on post-COVID collaborations. So you see, immediately after COVID pandemic, when the Korean experience was shared worldwide, many countries, including India, started entering into bilateral economic cooperation on bringing test kits and PPEs from South Korea, masks, test kits and PPEs from South Korea. So we see a new kind of cooperation, bilateral cooperation being entered into between the two countries. And here I would like to mention the bilateral cooperation between one of the important Korean company, Humasis. Humasis has signed an agreement to supply 5 lakhs test kits to Indian Council of Medical Research. And another important Korean company, it has set up its plant in Gurgaon. This is SD Biosensor. It has started production from its Manesar facility, from its Manesar center, and it has the capacity of producing 5 lakhs rapid test kits per week. And this will be further enhanced in coming weeks to meet growing demand. So I just wanted to highlight this, how this relationship between the two countries has taken a new turn in this post-COVID world. And the last important point in this post-COVID world, how it has shaped the relationship, is about India's participation and South Korea's entry into this Quad Plus meetings. We have all been talking about Quad, that is the quadrilateral alliance or partnership, which is still in making between India, US, Japan, and Australia. But in the wake of this COVID pandemic, Quad Plus meeting was also held in March 2020, where 3 other Indo-Pacific powers, that is New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam, has also entered into this bilateral negotiation. And video conference was held between the leaders of these Quad Plus countries, and they have been interacting on a weekly basis on a wide range of issues, such as cooperation in the field of vaccine development, addressing questions around stranded citizens, and minimizing economic impact of COVID crisis. So this was some of the new points which I wanted to highlight, how it has shaped the current relationship between India and South Korea. And let me conclude by this quote from this is a quote from the speech of Prime Minister Modi when he visited Korea in February 2019. Let me quote him. India's vision concerning Indo-Pacific puts special emphasis on inclusiveness, ASEAN centrality, and shared prosperity. This is an area in which India and Korea can work together for the benefit of the whole region and the whole world, based on their shared values and interests. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a thoughtful and comprehensive lecture. I hope there would be many questions. First of all, Shashank, you may start your camera and ask question to ma'am.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for your talked about two spatial emotional connections, one was historical and one is recent. And you also talked about the complementarity that the two economies have in terms of software and hardware complementarity, and in other forms too, like semiconductors, we have a complementarity. I would like to connect these two things and bring something called economic emotion. And when we talk of economic emotion, we find a basic distrust among the business ventures, especially the Indian business ventures and the South Korean business ventures. We see that in case of Japan, most of the ventures we have are joint ventures where Japanese companies have really played a minor role, giving a major role to Indian companies. Whereas in case of South Korea, most of the business ventures try to go alone. Like either we talk of Samsung, which is the biggest business venture of South Korea that we have in India. It tries to go alone, which actually impacts India's Make in India initiative. It's the amount of export that it can have if we have a joint venture. And the other challenge that we see there is the emerging trade war that nearly recently escalated between Japan and South Korea, because India and Japan have strategic as well as very strong economic relations, whereas the trade war between South Korea and Japan those relations have an impact upon India-South Korea relations.
Are we going to collect all questions, or one by one I respond?
Ma'am, one by one we will be doing.
Okay. Thank you, Shashank, for your inputs. And in fact, you have raised a very important point. But this is again, this has to be sorted out at the G2G level, particularly when you talked about these joint ventures and how the difference between the South Korean joint ventures in India and the Japanese joint ventures in India. Yes, these are some of the things that we have to take into consideration and see how the trust can be further rebuilt. And your second question related to the trade war between South Korea and Japan and how it has influenced India-South Korea relations. Yes, in fact, this is a major challenge in the Indo-Pacific region, because in the Indo-Pacific region, South Korea, Japan, they are very important countries. And India has very good relations with Japan as well as South Korea. So this trade war between Japan and South Korea has become a challenge for India, because India also at times has to take a stand. And there it has to take a stand in such a manner so that it doesn't alienate either of the two partners. So it has to balance in a very strategic manner, so that when it is siding with Japan, it should not alienate or isolate South Korea. Similarly, while partnering with Japan, it has to take its stand in such a manner so that it doesn't alienate South Korea. So this is a very important challenge, and good that you pointed out. But yes, our diplomatic community is handling it in a very diplomatic manner, in fact, and this has caused a major tension, not only in between the relationship between Japan and South Korea, but it is a major issue for the smaller powers in the region, where who do they side with. So thank you for raising this, and I truly agree with you that this is a very important challenge which has to be taken into consideration.
Second question, Abhishek. Ma'am, he is currently doing PhD from Korea only.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Sorry, good evening in Korea. I'm also in Korea. Ma'am, I have a question.
Where are you based, Abhishek?
Currently, I'm currently in Gwangju, Chon. I'm learning language right now. I'll go to Seoul for my PhD in international relations.
Presently, you are in Gwangju.
Yeah, I met you in Republic Day celebrations in Gwangju for a short period.
Okay, at GIST. At GIST? Was it at GIST?
No. I think it was somewhere near. No, it was not GIST. I don't remember the location. I think it was the Kim Dae-jung Memorial.
Okay, at the reception.
Yeah, at the reception. Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, I have a question related to the geopoliticals of the Indo-Pacific and the role of South Korea in it. And we know, ma'am, on May 20th, the White House released a report outlining US efforts to counter Chinese threat to American interest. And one of them was the Beijing intent, the Chinese intent to undermine and end the US alliance in Asia. And this is one of the major strategic challenge mentioned in that report, which US just published a few weeks back. South Korea, ma'am, as we know that it has been in dilemma. My question is a bit big because I'm giving a bit of background. Sorry for that. South Korea has been in dilemma ever since they installed the THAAD on the borders of South Korea to keep an eye on the North Korea, which had angered the Chinese. And after that, the Chinese Communist Party launched an economic warfare on Korean companies, which actually led to the loss of $15.6 billion to the Korean companies. And apart from that, China is the biggest trading partner of Korea. And Korea is one of those few countries which has not blamed or even point out anything on China regarding the corona outbreak. And it has not said anything, a word against China. And also the East Asia, the South China Sea also plays a major role in Korea's interest because of its energy transport. And despite all this and because of all this and despite US pressure, Korea is unwilling to join the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, FOIP, which is a strategy to contain China, as we all know. But Korea has also not denied the proposal of not joining the FOIP, which shows that how confused the government is. So what can be done by both US and in fact done by India as well to bring the Korean government or the Korea to, especially in this front, in order to not contain China, but at least tackle China in such a way that will help both US and kind of India as well, because nowadays the US and China, the US and India are both lining in the same direction against China. And what could be the impact of these what will be the impact on the Indo-Pacific geopolitics? What do you think about this?
Thank you, Abhishek, for your intervention. In fact, this question is, in fact, it can be answered only in a very diplomatic way because, during my presentation also, I had pointed out that when you talk about the India or South Korea's strategy towards the Indo-Pacific, or particularly towards the rise of China's assertiveness or its aggressive rise, basically India and South Korea or other major powers in the region, they are following the strategy of balancing, where I told you that in this they either follow hedging or balancing, and in this strategy they try to enter into economic partnership with a particular country, and they enter into security partnership with the other country, and then they try to balance both the countries either through economic partnership or through security partnership. So here, when you talk about South Korea's relationship with China, it is highly weighted so far as the economic context is concerned, so far as the economy is concerned. So here it is completely biased. So it cannot, in spite of the China's opposition against the military, US military buildup in South Korea, South Korea is not in a position to take a strong stand against China because of its strong economic connection with China. Similar is the position of other smaller powers in the region, and even India. India has so many issues with China, but still, given the economic concerns, we have not stopped our trade and commercial ties with China. So that has to be taken into consideration. And this is precisely the reason why South Korea has also not taken any clear-cut stand on free FOIP. It is just trying to say, try to follow a policy of appeasement, you can say, where it is even saying either not going with it, yes, or even clearly not saying no. So this you can say based on the geopolitics and based on the security concerns, based on the economic concerns, this is the only best possible strategy which South Korea can adopt in the given circumstances. And even you talked about the South China Sea. So yes, we know how assertive China has become in this entire South China Sea conflict. But yes, Again, because of the economic constraints, South Korea has not been able to make a clear-cut stand on this. And what would be its impact on the Indo-Pacific? In fact, it's going to be really challenging for the other countries of the region, because this policy of balancing and appeasement will ultimately not help, because we have seen how this COVID pandemic has become widespread, and it had, this is one example, how it has engulfed the entire world. So if this is high time, and this is high time to react and take a clear-cut stand, if the entire humanity has to be saved.
Thank you, ma'am.
Next question, Sagar.
Okay. Good evening, ma'am. Nice presentation and nice speech. We have learned a lot from relation between South Korea, India, Indo-Pacific. My question is, there are two questions from my side. First question is that in the past, South Korean president visited India and had given 3P policy regarding cooperation for people, peace and prosperity. But we have found an issue that the South Korean people are still finding difficulty in finding the, you can say, separation, finding a distinguish, means you can say identify who is Indian, who is Indonesian. They are just struggling with India and Indonesian, and we have listened lots of violence issue also regarding this. So what is the thing about this India-Indonesia concept with regard to South Korea and the president 3P policy? And second thing is that recently in few years, I think 2015 or 16, Modi has given Sagar Doctrine. So I want to ask that what is the impact of Sagar Doctrine in Indo-Pacific as well as on the South Korea?
Thank you, Sagar, for your question. Coming to your first issue of India and Indonesians. In fact, generally, when staying in Korea, living in South Korea, like when you interact with any Korean, they call you as Indo. So that has become, you can, like they don't call you as Indians. Indo is the word with which they denote you. And from Indo, they automatically go to Indonesia. So that is the confusion between the Indian identity and the Indonesian identity. So that is something we here at the Cultural Center, we are also trying to educate people and trying to create awareness. And yes, we are trying to spread information about India, and we have been doing it through various means, conducting outreach programs. We are extending our outreach activities at the school level, so that children at the school level they are educated properly. They are made aware of this fact, so that when they grow up, they have a proper understanding about a particular country. We have outreach programs in the universities. We organize India Days at several places throughout Korea, in different provinces and in different cities. So we are trying our bit to create more and more awareness about this. Your second question was about this Moon Jae-in's 3Ps policy. In fact, people, prosperity, progress, these are important pillars of India-South Korea relationship, and in fact it talks about prosperity, because without prosperity, without economic and trade and commercial ties, you can't talk about a relationship flourishing between the two countries. The second important aspect is people. So people to people connectivity is also very important, as you had just talked about this the fact that they are not aware about India or Indonesia, and they consider India and Indonesia as same. So here people to people connection is very important. So that is another pillar of relationship between the two countries. And peace, again, we can't ignore peace, because this entire Indo-Pacific region and the Korean Peninsula is considered to be a hotbed of conflict, and not only Korean Peninsula, but below also, during in the South China Sea region, you see it is also a hotbed of controversy. So here peace is very important aspect of the relationship between the two countries. Both the countries together, they are trying to establish peace in the region, so as to make the region safe for humanity on a long-term basis. And your third question was related to Sagar. India's concept of Sagar, that is security and growth for all in the region. This concept has been given by Indian Prime Minister, and yes, again it talks about security and growth for all in the region, which again coincides, and it has convergence with the concept of peace, prosperity, and people, peace, and prosperity as given by the South Korean president. So the idea of this Sagar is to consider all powers in the region as equal, and the focus is to have peace and security in the region, so that all the countries they can prosper together. And the common, you can say, the common target or the common point which it is trying to hit is China. The idea is to bring all the smaller countries in the regions, in the Pacific Island regions, and the other middle powers in the region at one page, so as to contain the assertive and the aggressive rise of China in the region. That is the entire, you can say, approach of Sagar.
So, ma'am, there would be a formal vote of thanks from our side, although we do not require it, as I feel you are our own. But although Jagannath Kashyap will give you a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would like to express my profound gratitude on the behalf of this entire team of All India Debating Society, that despite of your high engagements, you agreed to deliver this lecture on our platform. And ma'am, I must say, like in cricket, we see day-night match. It was a day-night lecture, as we started when there was late evening in Korea, and now the vision outside clearly shows that it's night. So thank you so much, ma'am. And ma'am, I would like to say that you quoted many eminent thinkers and global leaders to give conceptual clarity during your lecture. So I would quote Plato for you, which will really fit upon you. Plato had said that he who wishes to serve his country must have not only the power to think, but the will to act. So it's a matter of pride for us, ma'am, that you are one amongst our academic fraternity who is actually participating in real world diplomacy. So we're proud upon you, ma'am. And it was quite evident from your lecture, the way you led the background by making us know about the increasing importance of Indo-Pacific region. And then you talked about the deeper cultural connect of India and Korea, and which saw one thing crystal clear, that right from beginning, right from history, India never used coercive force to influence the globe, but it was our rich culture and values which won the heart of millions of people. Your lecture highlighted that. Simultaneously, after that, you proceeded and you came to the present world dynamics, and with these backgrounds, you very well articulated that how India and Korea can be mutually advantageous, or India-Korea partnership can mutually benefit both the country in this multipolar world. So it was a concept-loaded package of lecture, I must say. Indeed, it was very lucid, conclusive, and it will not only be beneficial for we students of political science on IR, but it will be equally very purposeful for the commoners who have any interest in understanding this bipolar relation or the multipolar world. So once again, I express my deepest gratitude to you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jagannath, and thank you, Roshan, Vatan, and the entire team of Indian Debating Society. It was really nice to connect with you all, and also to some of my former students. Shyam was there, Vineet was there, Vatan, I think Shashank was there, but Shyam couldn't connect, but it was really great. And also Abhishek, it was nice to connect with him also from South Korea. Thank you.